As the title of my contribution suggests, my idea was to use the concept of post-feminism to think about the discourse of feminist musicology. Now, I will mostly be speaking about the Anglo-American world because this is the context in which both discourses are dominant and in which they both appeared. And I will, on multiple accounts, reference also liberalism and second-wave feminism, which are connected to the idea of post-feminism. The reason for my research is a very strong need to understand how can we analyze music and gender, especially since music is non-mimetic. It is very difficult. It is impossible to say that music means something, and on the other hand, gender is a very bodily, very corporeal element. So this was a challenge for me, and I also have a constant need for thinking about the discourses I use to explain my own position and to think of why and how a discourse works. What are its issues, what are its problems, and how can we make them better. At the very beginning, I would like to very shortly review some basic elements of feminist musicology. These are some of the published articles and books on the subject, and it is visible that they deal with performance, with composition. Some deal with gender, some with women, some with music, some with musicology, some with the feminism. So this is a sort of cluster of terms that is used to explain that is used within the field of feminist musicology. It is also interesting to note that some publications actually take musicology as a given and then analyze music from the musicological standpoint. Others refer to musicology itself. Some refer to aesthetics. Some review popular music, sexuality, and so on. So it's a very wide terrain of subjects that have been in the focus of feminist scholarship as such, and then applied to study of classical music. Some initial work in feminist musicology is the archival work, which was focused on discovering or rediscovering female composers, and this was done in the 70s and the 80s. A kind of boom happened during the 1990s, and it was marked symbolically by the publishing of Feminine Endings by Susan McClary, which is a very important book. Some would say the most important first book for feminist musicology, even though a lot of work has been done before that. And there is a decrease in number of publications during the past 2 decades, which is something that Sally MacArthur, an Australian musicologist, has also noted. And she will be of very great importance for me and this research because she has done a lot of reviews of feminist discourse in musicology and different approaches and so on. Here are some of her, here's one of her division of approaches in feminist musicology. So liberal, radical, and neoliberal. The neoliberal is, I guess, not so clear for me, at least, and I would connect it to post-feminism with the emphasis on the individual, power, combination between actually victimhood and power, and so on. It has mostly focused on women as strong, composers as all-powerful, emancipated women, and so on. And radical and liberal feminist approach is something that is more present within the feminist musicological discourse. So all of the three discourses have liberalism as their joint element, because they all appeared within the liberal context, no matter how they treated the ideas of liberal feminisms. But ideas of freedom, freedom of choice, freedom of expression, fight for equality, liberation from oppression, they are all typical for liberal and later for neoliberal system and ideology, and are actually embedded within each one with different emphasis. And so I turn to post-feminism because one of the it is interesting to note that many authors, like for example Angela McRobbie, they place the beginning of post-feminism somewhere around 1990s, just at the time when feminist musicology was developing. So some elements of post-feminist culture are present in feminist musicology, together with those that were typical for second wave feminism. Now, there is this very interesting connection between second wave feminism, post-feminism, neoliberalism, capitalism. It's a very interesting, very provocative, very dynamic context. And one definition is that what appears distinctive about contemporary post-feminist culture is precisely the extent to which a selectively defined feminism has been so overtly taken into account, as Angela McRobbie has noted, albeit in order to emphasize that is no longer needed. And this might be one reason why feminist musicology has dwindled in the past 20 years, because it is felt that it has achieved its goal like other feminisms too. Same authors note that post-feminist culture works in part to incorporate, assume, or naturalize aspects of feminism. And the significance of post-feminist culture lies in its pervasive presence, not just in film, television, and popular literature, but in advertising, magazines, music, and political discourse. So post-feminism, in a way, assumes that feminism is there. It selects certain elements of feminism, which are those that were typical for second wave feminism, like freedom of oppression, equality, freedom for everyone, individual freedom, and so on, and incorporates them into everyday lives so that we feel like feminism is not needed. Because of this very complicated issue of post-feminism, Rosalind Gill speaks about sensibility, and she defines these features of post-feminist sensibility. The bolded features are those that are, I believe, found in that are important for feminist musicology. Femininity is a bodily property, focus on individualism, choice, and empowerment, and resurgence in ideas of natural sexual difference. These are some elements of post-feminist sensibility that I will shortly mention in the following minutes of my presentation. Now, as I mentioned, liberal ideas are very important for feminist musicology. And Ryan Musgrave actually wrote a very interesting paper about how liberal feminism, how its focus on the law and on the equality under the law have actually been transferred into the aesthetic of music. And Susan McClary said the same thing in her Feminine Endings. And she says that this work, referring to the work of feminist scholars up until the 1990s, makes it possible for us to proceed without having to define ex nihilo such basic concepts as gender, sexuality, and femininity. We're able to benefit from the debates that have enlivened feminist scholarship and to arrive at our tasks with a sophisticated theoretical apparatus already at hand. So basically, from what Susan McClary writes, we can understand that the early feminist musicologists actually took the achievements of feminism and musicological discourse and put them together in order to understand women as a subject of music. Now, one liberal concept that is closely connected to identity politics as well as to the idea of individualism in music is manifested in this formulation, women in music. So most work of feminist musicologists is dedicated to women's music, and it is aimed at achieving equality for historical women composers as well as for contemporary composers. So this is one important aspect of women in music. And this kind of formulation establishes an identity, which is woman composer, and seeks its recognition within the field of classical music. And one of the strategies is employed is to show that women composers are equally brilliant as men. And they also understand women's music as a expression of personal freedom. And this is where we find the individual. This is also something that corresponds with how musicology works generally, which is also, I would argue, a liberal model of thinking, where you feel that music is the expression of the self. It is the art. It is something highly individual, and so on. And actually, this idea of, well, post-feminist, as it would appear, and this idea of a romantic idea of a genius creator are actually something that musicology and feminism have in common. So many women have actually written about other exceptional women in music, and this is actually how the whole way of thinking in the West works, about talented, special individuals who run politics or arts or economics. So we are full of, our histories are based around men, about individuals. So this is a content page for Feminine Endings by Susan McClary, and she offers a kind of combination between theoretical chapters like sexual politics and classical music, where she questions how classical music works and also how musicology works. Then she also speaks of women's voices, or say about Madonna or Laurie Anderson. And she also writes about how women are constructed within men's music, like Monteverdi, or how they're represented as mad women in so many musical pieces. In a similar way, Sheila Whitley writes about women in popular music, so it is divided according to women and what they do. And this is an example of chapters in Sally MacArthur's book Feminist Aesthetic in Music, where she actually attempts to find feminine features in music by Anne Boyd or Alma Mahler or Rebecca Clark, and so on. So the body, introducing the body into musicology, has also been one important project that turns out to reference the way the female body and sexual difference are introduced and understood within the framework of liberal feminism. So Sally MacArthur uses this term radical feminism, and much of that in musicology is dedicated to finding the feminine in music, looking for some features that might be representation of a female experience of the world within classical music. And the attempt to bring the body into the musicological discourse has been done in order to question the body-mind division, where body is connected to women and mind to men, and music is solely connected to the mind, so solely an abstract action. So Suzanne Cusick writes that identification of both composer and music as mind may be our discipline's version of what Donna Haraway calls the God trick, the epistemological illusion of all-encompassing and thus objective knowledge. So the body is there to criticize the universal knowledge about music. And she says that when music theorists and musicologists ignore the bodies whose performative acts constitute the thing called music, we ignore the feminine. So interestingly enough, feminist musicology tried to show that women are in fact capable of composing by emancipating the body in a way and attempting to grasp what feminist aesthetics in music could be. Sally MacArthur writes that feminist aesthetics, this is a quote, invokes at least two different kinds of meaning. First, it refers specifically to cultural artifacts created by women, including the ways in which these are created as a means of articulating a different voice within the fields of literature, art, and music. Second, in some ways linked to the first meaning, it refers to the feminine or the female body itself. And all of this writing is in fact connected to French feminism and the idea of female writing, of the need for women to write with their bodies in order to change or question discourses of literature, philosophy, and so on. And this actually corresponds to what GILL pinpoints as the notion that femininity is a bodily property. Feminist musicology attempted to question oppressive outlook on classical music, which connects it to the mind and thus to men. By viewing music as an autonomous art, the body is being negated, and by negating the body, the discourse is actually hiding the fact that women are excluded from classical music. Introducing the body into such a discourse can indeed have a strong critical potential, yet, as it turns out, such a practice didn't result in changing the basic structure of musicology and classical music, as it was caught in the liberal model of equality and the need for recognition. So, this is the last point I will talk about. I tried to be as brief as possible. I would like to say that now, as I have done the research, I have read a lot, I am none the wiser, and I have more questions than answers in the end. However, I would have to, of course, emphasize that just as feminism has done a substantial amount of work, so has feminist musicology, and we definitely think of women in music in a different way, attempting to find these liberal points within the feminist musicological discourse has had was so that I could find something that has proven to be a weak spot from today's point of view. It is kind of obvious that liberal feminism does not work, and that working within this framework is not actually bringing anything. It is keeping us inside this loop that makes us feel that we are doing something without actually making any change. And this is something that Nancy Fraser writes a lot about, Wendy Brown as well, with her wounded attachments. The term post-feminism has helped me a lot in order to find these elements that are rendering feminism useless today. Useless under quotes, of course, very big quotes, because you can always argue that helping women find jobs, feel empowered and so on is not a bad thing. The problem is that within the framework of neoliberal capitalism, this is not enough, and is unfortunately more often used by the system than it works against the system. So of course that there are many liberal elements within the feminist musicology, because it appeared in the Anglo-American liberal system, so there couldn't be anything else. But my idea here was to try to pinpoint some aspects of feminist musicology that might need to be changed in order for its goal to be achieved. Now, this emphasis on brilliant and talented women as the center of feminist musicological research actually corresponds to this strong individualism that is promoted by liberalism and by neoliberal capitalism. And it is actually not focusing on all women or many women or women as a group. Another thing is this very problematic position of body, because somehow we are always speaking about bodies of women, and we are unable, if we say that they're not important, we're hiding the female gender. If we emphasize it, then we're stuck within the identity politics, unable to move. And I think the idea of natural sexual difference has always been there. And the very fact that we are defining women as a special category within music means that we are attempting to differentiate women from men. So feminist musicology is indeed very much entangled with issues of contemporary feminism, and finding ways to promote women within classical music actually needs to be informed by current happenings in feminism. So as it is obvious that the neoliberal capitalism needs to be changed. The very system needs to be changed in order for actual change for actual women to happen. So I believe we need to question some of the basic concepts of musicology, like the artwork, the idea of a genius, the idea of exceptional artists, the idea of close reading, and so on. I'm not saying that they need to be removed or thrown away. I just feel that this is where the criticism of feminist musicology should turn its attention to. So thank you for listening, and I hope that we can maybe discuss this in more detail during the discussion.
Hi, and thank you for watching my presentation. This presentation will focus on the relationship between one famously traditional discipline such as musicology and the relatively new academic field, metal music studies. I will look into some key musicological contributions to the field which emerged during the past few decades. I will also offer an answer to the questions: what is the role of musicology in the study of metal music, and what can musicology offer to this field? This type of discussion is inevitably a continuation of the debate on the status, role, and, it may be argued, limits of musicology in the broader scope of popular music studies. It will as such hopefully give a valuable insight into the particular, exciting, and growing field of metal music studies and popular music studies in general. As I've pointed out in the abstract, the research of metal music in academia started during the 1980s and was crowned with two invaluable studies. The first of those two studies, Heavy Metal, the Music and Its Culture, was written by sociologist Dina Weinstein. The second one, Running with the Devil, Power, Gender and Madness in Heavy Metal Music, was written by musicologist Robert Walser. The relevance of these studies was underlined in virtually all subsequent research endeavors in the field. However, although the sporadic and pivotal academic works appeared towards the end of the century and during the first decade of the new millennia, the scholarly field started forming actually nearing the 2010s. One of the inaugural events was the first Heavy Fundamentalisms conference in Salzburg in October 2008. Since then, the proliferation of metal studies is evident, to which the foundation of the International Society for Metal Music Studies in 2013 and its specialized scientific journal, Metal Music Studies, speak volumes. In their editorial foreword to the issue of Metal Music Studies from 2019, dedicated to the theme of musicology and metal, Louis Kennedy and Salimia Woods quote some interesting observations coming from Sheila Whiteley and Keith Kahn-Harris, dating back to 2010 and 2011 respectively. In essence, these prominent authors lamented the lack of musicological insight into metal studies, which would consider the sound of music itself. As Kahn-Harris noted, and I quote, "Without some widely accepted vocabulary for identifying the constituent musical features of metal, there is a danger that metal studies will be founded on a tacit assumption that we all know what metal sounds like." Even though the musicological input in metal studies has significantly expanded, it is worth questioning what do these remarks refer to when it comes to the methodology, research subjects, and the results. By mapping the critical points of musicological thought, we will see its crucial features regarding the study of metal music as music and metal music sound. So, this presentation will give a short insight into the nature of musicological contributions to the metal studies during the last several decades, with particular attention given to Metal Music Studies Journal. As a leading voice in what was then known as the New Musicology, and one of the first examples of musicological inquiry into metal, Running with the Devil definitely sets the base of academic analysis in this field. Walser's research of heavy metal sound concerning society and the context in which it is produced and consumed establish a strong bond of distinctive musical elements such as timbre, high volume, preferred modes, harmonic and rhythmic features, and the prominence of the guitar solo with their effect on its societal surroundings and vice versa. The debate of power, gender, and madness, or in other words, Walser's take on the history of the heavy metal genre, musicological analysis of popular music, issues of appropriation of classical virtuosity models by metal guitarists, gender and horror and mysticism in postmodern times, all rest on the assumption of the primarily social nature of music. Likewise, other than being a thorough analysis of heavy metal music at the time, Carrie M. Berger pointed out that this piece of work was also a form of cultural intervention in the midst of the fight with the PMRC, which was led by Tipper Gore, against heavy metal and rap music in the US Congress. Although some metal scholars that often come from different disciplines are easy to say that Walser's study is outdated and the product of its time, it is essential to mitigate this stance with a view for musicology that is otherwise very traditional and rigid discipline. This is especially true for peripheral musicologies that, unlike the one with the Anglo-Saxon provenance, which championed musicological investigation of popular music, still to this date have difficulty grasping such an idea. Academic works such as Walser's can be a powerful remedy in such a context, and a pointer for musicology of popular and especially metal music. During the first decade of the 21st century, the awakening field of academic studies of metal witnessed some sporadic but essential contributions to the field. One can notice that studies such as Natalie Purcell's Death Metal Music, the Passion and Politics of a Subculture, and Kahn-Harris' Extreme Metal Music and Culture on the Edge focus on the subgenres of metal that came from the genre branching throughout the 80s and the 90s and their subcultural features and dynamics, utilizing methodologies and perspectives of sociology, politics, and ethnology. As for musicologists in this nascent scientific area, there are but a few large-scale metal music investigations. Harris Berger's ethnomusicological study, Metal, Rock and Jazz, published in 1999, should be mentioned here as an example of research across the scene boundaries. Continuing Walser's and therefore Susan McClary's school of thought, two authors published monographs on Metallica and Led Zeppelin. By combining musicology and ethnographical methodology in her book In the Houses of the Holy, Led Zeppelin and the Power of Rock Music, Susan Fast explored issues such as ritual, gender, body, difference, and representation. However, it is debatable whether this particular study should be included in the Metal Studies bibliography, especially considering the research on Led Zeppelin that came after, as we will shortly see. Meanwhile, in his book Damage Incorporated, Metallica and the Production of Musical Identity, Glenn Pillsbury employs interdisciplinary methodology, enriching musicological insight with the study of media, music industry, race, and gender questions. As an example of the traditional and formalistic strains of musicology, a book by Finnish musicologist Esa Lilja, Theory and Analysis of Classic Heavy Metal Harmony, should be highlighted. Here, the author explores melodic and harmonic features of heavy metal of the so-called classic era by employing various types and methods of music analysis. There are three hypotheses upon which this research was carried out. I quote, "Acoustic characteristics play a significant role for chord constructing in heavy metal. Heavy metal has strong ties and similarities with other Western musical styles, and therefore theories and analytical methods of Western art music may be applied to heavy metal." End of quote. Given that the analytical tools that the author uses are the same ones utilized in Western art music or church music, the author stands that heavy metal music is a product of cultural fusion and as such is, I quote, "neither isolated nor self-sufficient with respect to its harmonic language," end of quote, should be underlined. In his book Black Sabbath and the Rise of Heavy Metal Music, Andrew Cope works on analyzing the syntactical design of heavy metal in its social context, while working on the precise and, as he writes, clear musical and aesthetic dichotomy between Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin, which represent early heavy metal and hard rock respectively. By focusing on the sonic and social traits of this particular period, Cope also worked as a historian, studying the scene's development during the late 60s and the 70s, as well as the external, meaning other genres such as blues and rock and roll, influences on this process. As mentioned, a series of several events that occurred near the end of the first decade of the 21st century, and especially during the 2010s, are crucial for the institutional basis of metal music studies. The foundation of the International Society for Metal Music Studies in 2013 is probably the most important one, mainly because it announced the emergence of the new scientific paradigm. Having in mind that the first global conference on metal was held in 2008, starting from 2013, the ISMS began organizing regular international and inter- and multidisciplinary conferences biannually. Finally, the foundation of ISM's specialized scientific journal, Metal Music Studies, signified the beginning of so-called autonomy that metal scholars long strived for. This autonomy was particularly important concerning popular music studies, as Bill Stroh noticed in his keynote speech at the ISMS conference in Nantes in 2019. The publication pool on metal became vast. There have been more books, collected publications, dissertations, chapters, articles, and other types of texts than ever before. Even though the contributions from different disciplines still exceeded musicologists in extent and numbers, the growth of musicological knowledge on metal is indisputable. For this occasion, I will highlight Eric Smielek's dissertation, Genre and Expression in Extreme Metal Music, as the first book-length musicological study of extreme metal, which uses an interdisciplinary mixture of literary genre theory, semiotics, music theory and analysis, acoustics and linguistics to scrutinize musical, verbal and visual systems of meaning in extreme metal. With the establishment of the MMS journal in particular, metal scholars coming from various disciplines such as sociology, musicology, aesthetics, cultural studies, history, psychology, etc., created their intellectual hub and started building a unique resource for the field. There are several musicological papers published in the journal in the first years, which deal with the emergence of the metal scenes, narrative structures of extreme metal, analysis of guitar solos, historical development, sound aesthetics, and production techniques of the distorted electric guitar, composition, effects of guitar distortion, sonic transgressions and objection, just to name a few. The third issue of the fifth volume of the MMS journal is dedicated to the theme of metal and musicology in its entirety, with 6 articles derived from the same name conference held at the University of Halle. Having in mind the less traditional definition of musicology, which deems this interdiscipline best understood simply as positioning sonic phenomena as primary when examining metal music culture, the papers in this issue explore and apply methodologies of performance and production in genre determination, vocal science and vocal pedagogy, compositional approach to metal, fans and listening, traditional analytical approach to harmony and form in music, phonoaudiology, sound and paratextual analysis. That said, this journal issue, despite being small in volume, shows the striking diversity of musicological approaches and hints towards the contemporary and future flourishing and heterogeneity of inter- and transdisciplinary research of metal, which will be rooted in musicology. To reiterate a common knowledge phrase, as a fundamentally interdisciplinary field, musicology in its core embraces different and co-active fields of study. History and music analysis, of course, come to mind first. While studying metal music and popular music in general, musicology can benefit from employing the methods of her sister discipline, ethnomusicology, as we have seen in Robert Walser's monograph and many consecutive studies. The variety and number of these collaborative disciplines grow by the minute, especially having in mind the technological development with regards to musical performance, recording and dissemination of music, communication in general, and the nature of the musicological work as such. Together with countless new possibilities that musicians, producers, and fans are encountering, musicologists, like other scientists in the 21st century, are very comfortable with working on computers, enjoying access to virtual libraries and archives all over the world, and lately suffering from overwhelm and overconsumption of valuable and not so valuable information. It had come a time when, contrary to what Con Harris and other metal scholars said to have experienced throughout the 1990s, explorers of metal can access an incredible amount of previously and currently executed research and recorded music. This also indicates that we are, or we should be, aware of the abundance of musicological endeavors. Metal musicology today, as we have briefly seen in this presentation, deals with sound, instruments, technology, music composition and analysis, as well with the history of metal music, music's information, social implications of the music, audience and listening, gender, racial and class issues, and workings of the music industry. Potentially monolithic perceptions of musicology, as Kennedy and Yavuz marked, are debunked and disproven by the work of contemporary metal musicologists, and I, for one, am happy and excited to see what the future holds for the field. Thank you.